When it comes to game consoles and handhelds, one of my favorites has to be the PSP. From RPGs to PS1 games to action games to remakes, it had basically everything I could ever want. And that obviously includes a lot of obscure and wacky stuff. Throughout the years, I've made a habit of getting as many weird games I've never heard of before as possible. For all the systems I own, whenever I see them for dirt cheap, be it at a second-hand reseller who doesn't know the game's actual value, or weird bootleg cartridges and discs that hold several of them at once. Thanks to this, I ended up amassing a collection of hundreds of games for several systems in what I like to call dumpster diving. Thanks to this, I was able to discover games I ended up genuinely liking a lot, such as the Sword of Hysteria or Miami Crisis. Usually, I play these games for the first time alongside friends, but today, I've randomly picked out a handful of them that looked interesting and would like to share that experience with all of you as well. One thing I need to clarify here is that I'll be stretching the definition of the term PSP game a bit with this, as if they get chosen by the randomizer, I will be talking about ports and other things like that. So for the sake of this video, we'll just consider every game that was ever released on the PSP an actual PSP game. With that said, let's grab into the bag and see what we got. The first game on the list is Fuun Shinsengumi Bakumatsu Den Portable, and Jesus Christ, is that a mouthful that I probably butchered to hell and back. It's a port of a PS2 game of the same name and is set in feudal Japan, meaning you get to be a badass samurai. There are several characters with their own story modes, and visually it doesn't look that bad for a PSP game. What I find more interesting is that there's actually 3 sword stances and all characters are able to use 2 of them. There's also this thing you can do where you bash your head against an enemy that leads into a grapple sometimes when they're not blocking. The game's difficulty is all over the place. Missions where you have more than 2 partners are a complete joke that can be beaten by mindlessly mashing the attack button for like 2 minutes. But missions with less than that are an absolute nightmare, with enemies bombarding you from all sides. Not to mention that some characters' movesets are infinitely better than others, making their stages a lot easier. Another thing that ended up bothering me quite a bit is the music. It's not poorly composed or anything, just pretty forgettable. Really, but that's not the issue. The problem is that it loops a lot. Every track is no longer than a minute and a half, so you'll be hearing the music stop and restart really frequently. It's quite jarring and gets infuriating very quickly. All around though, it's not a bad game, just a kind of forgettable one. Maybe the PS2 original is better, but I have yet to play that one. If y'all would like to see me make a PS2 grabbag video as well and include it there, be sure to let me know, but other than that, I'd say we move on. Next up is the Akuma Hunter's Exorsister. This game is part of the Simple 2500 Portable series. For the uninitiated, the Simple series was a long-running series of small, cheap games made on a tiny budget for several systems like the PS2, the Nintendo DS, and of course, the PSP. That alone might sound like a recipe for disaster, but it wasn't all bad. Some good game series got their start as Simple series titles, like Earth Defense Force, so playing one of these games is like reaching into a mystery box on its own. You never know what to expect. It could be anything from actually pretty solid to hilariously terrible. As for Exorsister, well, this game's terrible. Actually awful. It's an action game in the vein of Devil May Cry, and giving the game that description alone feels like a cardinal sin. You have the choice between 4 exorcist women with god-awful fashion sense who all play differently from one another. 2 of them have a focus on melee combat while the other 2 rely on ranged weapons. That actually doesn't change a lot, because the melee characters can still use ranged attacks with magic, and the ranged characters can still just hit the enemies with their guns anyway. At the end of the day, the melee characters are better though, because their combos don't suck ass and they don't make the camera have a fit every time you attack an enemy. There's also a menu for equipping your gear and it's called Dress Up. I won't elaborate, but you seem decently intelligent, I'm sure you can figure out what it means. I think the worst part about this game is that killing an enemy isn't enough. You have to purify them first by locking onto them, charging holy magic bullets or whatever this is supposed to be, and purifying them. The issue here is that doing this leaves you vulnerable, and you'll usually be surrounded by several other enemies that will try to interrupt you, and if you take too long, the enemies will just revive. In conclusion, this game is about as good as it looks. Keeping with the theme of terrible looking games, here's Silverfall. First thing you've probably noticed the second the segment started is, well, the textures are flat as hell and the models look like they were put together in seconds. Sadly, the actual areas themselves don't look much better. Everywhere you go looks the exact same, and it would be impossible to not get lost without the help of a map. Gameplay-wise, it's a generic Diablo clone set in an even more generic fantasy world. Character creation basically boils down to, do you want more fantasy weapons and magic, or machines? Which in a way is similar to Arcanum, but honestly comparing the two games is like comparing a regular boat trip to the Titanic incident, and I really don't have much more to say about this game. It's not terrible or unplayable by any means, but it's not good or fun in any way either, it just exists. If you're into bad Diablo clones, go ahead, have fun I guess. Otherwise, I don't see the point in playing it. Finally, something that isn't terrible. Toukiden is fun. It's a game from the era where everyone and their mother wanted to have at least one Monster Hunter game under their belt, and that included Koei Tecmo. Easily the most stand-up part of this game is the fact that it's set in a fantasy version of feudal Japan with a severe yokai infestation problem. As mentioned before, I love these kinds of settings, and to me it feels like a Monster Hunter-style version of Nioh. Though that might just be because I've been playing Nioh 2 lately and it's been kicking my ass pretty badly. Motherfucker! God damn it, fuck! Aside from the regular Monster Hunter-style combat, the game does a lot to stand apart from its brethren, like being able to offer money to a shrine before each mission, giving you a temporary buff, or equipping a Mitama to your weapon, which allows you to use their different abilities like magic attacks. The coolest part about the Mitamas, in my opinion, is the fact that they're in some form based on historical and mythological figures. And going back to the Nioh comparison, there's also expendable items that let you enchant your weapon to give them a temporary elemental attribute. Another thing that stands out is that instead of just being able to kill enemies and getting loot, you first have to purify their corpses in order to get something. But unlike Exorsister, this isn't a major pain in the ass here. The game isn't anything amazing or particularly special, but it's fun for what it's worth, and I'm sure you could have a good time playing it with friends. And this game is also set in feudal Japan. I swear this was entirely random picks on a wheel where I put all of the games down on. I didn't choose for like 3 of them to have a similar setting, I swear. Anyway, Kingdom is a Musou. It was made by Konami, and you can parry attacks by blocking at the right time. And that's all I can say about it. See, the issue with Musou is that a lot of the games are incredibly similar to one another, no matter who the developer is or what franchise it's attached to. Playing one is basically having played them all. That's why I personally just can't get any enjoyment out of them anymore. It's like having an alright burger for the first time and then being forced to eat it every day. You may like it to begin with, but eventually you'll start noticing more and more things about it you don't like and don't care about. And by the end of it, you'll have eaten it so often that it will have lost all flavor. That's Musou to me, and I'm sure plenty of people who've played more than 3 of them have had a similar experience. Ooh boy, Hysteria Project, now that is a fun one. This is an FMV horror game, and man was I surprised to find out that stuff like that was still being made at the time. It's actually part of the PSP mini-series, which, for context, was a collection of several 100 megabyte or smaller in file size, digital-only games that were released alongside the PSP Go, that could also be played on a PS3. Now, some of these games were ports of mobile games, this being one of them, and thus I am once again stretching the definition of a PSP game, but since I said it doesn't matter at the beginning of the video, I'm a-okay with that. It's a very basic FMV game with 2 actions, choosing what to do, and quick time events. Fail and you get one of the shittiest game over screens I've ever seen. The funniest part is that the QTEs basically don't matter because you can just spam every button on the controller at once and it'll still register as the right input. The only way to fail is to not press anything at all. What makes it even funnier is that because of the PSP video compression, you basically can't make out anything half the time, and I can't help but laugh at it like a dumbass. And it just gets better because the game tries desperately to have a mysterious and interesting story told only through imagery, but it fails at basically every occasion. And then it has the balls to not only end on a really shitty cliffhanger, but to follow up on it with a sequel too. This game is a gem of garbage and I love it for all the wrong reasons. And because my random wheel is being really weird right now, here's another PSP minigame. This time it's not a mobile port, but a completely original game. Phase Shift is a shoot 'em up in the style of Space Invaders. The main gimmick is the titular shift, which lets you swap between the top and bottom of the screen to attack enemies from behind, collect power-ups, or dodge incoming attacks. The game also kinda quickly ramps up in difficulty, which is probably great news for fans of the genre, but I suck at it. The music is also pretty nice. I like a good piano theme, but I feel it doesn't really fit the sci-fi hackerman vibe of the game. The most interesting thing I can say about it is that it has barely any online presence. From what I can gather, the developers, Dark Potato Studios, were a Chinese indie company who made literally nothing other than this game. In the end, I decided to play around with the files and modded it by replacing the ship with Low Tier God, the music with the Plock boss theme, the enemies with Louis Fonsi, and the power-ups with Alex from Yeek. Did I need to do this? Absolutely not, but it was really funny to me, so I did it anyway. If you're interested in seeing how and why I keep modding games for literally no reason, just like this or what I showed at the beginning of the video in the B-roll, then let me know. I think it'd make for an interesting video, but I'll let you be the judge of that. And last but most definitely not least is Coded Soul. This is probably the best and most interesting game on this list, and I'm shocked it's remained relatively obscure considering who made it. The developers were Sony's Japan studio, which housed the teams behind absolutely phenomenal games like Ape Escape, Eco, Forbidden Siren and Gravity Rush. But it was also co-developed by the studio Gaia, with the director being Koji Cozy Okada, who was one of the 6 founders of Atlus and a key figure in the creation of a lot of the company's franchises. This was the last game he ever worked on before completely disappearing from the face of the earth. With a resume like that, you'd assume the game would have gained at least some passive notoriety, but nope, nothing. The game itself is an action RPG with several roguelite and monster collection elements. Each floor of the World of Idea is randomly generated, and you have a set time limit in which you must traverse it, but you're given a map of its layout right at the start, so getting lost and running out of time because of that isn't a non-issue. The combat is very basic, with only a handful of combos for your sword and some magic ranged moves that allow you to use elemental attacks. But each enemy has resistances and weaknesses, and hitting the latter results in them being stunned for a few seconds, or until your next attack. The main issue I have with it is that there's no lock-on button, so sometimes it'll just end up with you hitting the air instead of your enemies. After beating an enemy, you'll also often get the possibility of capturing them by literally sucking up their souls in order to make them your slaves. And you can give them the commands as to what to do mid-combat. There are also weapon and item synthesis systems to get better gear, and a mechanic called Karma, which lets your monsters learn new skills. And if all this sounds really familiar to you, you can take a guess as to why. The story is centered around the research of a big magic crystal called the Monolith Gate, which is actually a portal to the world of Idea. The only one who can open it is a boy by the name of Gale, and he gives a soldier named Jay the power to travel there in order to save his girlfriend, May, who accidentally entered it and got lost. It's a basic plot, but it does what it needs to pretty well. I think the best part about this game is Jay's walk cycle, which makes him look like a caveman who's about to shit himself. As well as the soundtrack, which reminds me a lot of Phantasy Star Online, and if you know me, you know that's a very good thing. The victory theme in particular is a jam. All around I recommend this game, but be warned, it has no translation of any kind. And with that, we are done. 8 randomly selected PSP games in 15 minutes. Some good, some bad, and some are completely forgettable. I hope you enjoyed this little journey, and if you did, I'd be more than willing to make more of these kinds of videos. With that being said, I hope you have a fantastic morning, day, or evening. Cheers.